is the oldest woman on death row in the country.
Blanche Taylor Moore turns 90 years old Friday and will do so at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh.
Blanche Moore was a cold, calculating serial killer who used arsenic poisoning to eliminate anyone in her way. Over the years, she silently killed multiple men in her life, disguising herself as a grieving widow while her victims wasted away in agony. She was the original Black Widow. Her crimes took place across North Carolina, with the final murder happening in 1986. Blanche, a 55-year-old Southern woman, seemed like a devoted partner, but behind closed doors, she was a manipulative killer who used poison as her weapon of choice. Her last known victim, Raymond Reed, was her fiancé, a man who trusted her completely. In 1986, he suddenly fell ill, suffering from extreme vomiting, muscle failure, and excruciating pain. Doctors were baffled until toxicology reports revealed arsenic levels 60 times the lethal dose in his body. An investigation uncovered an even darker truth. Raymond wasn't the first. Blanche's first husband, James Napoleon Moore, and her father-in-law had died under identical circumstances. She had even taken out insurance policies on them, profiting from their deaths. Police exhumed the bodies and found high levels of arsenic, proving Blanche had been poisoning them for years. In 1990, she was convicted of first-degree murder for Raymond Reed's death and sentenced to death. As of February 2025, Blanche Moore remains on North Carolina's death row. Now over 90 years old, she may die of old age before she is ever executed. Robin Rowe. It takes a lot to remain Idaho's only woman on death row. But Robin Lee Rowe earned that title by murdering her entire family in cold blood. In a twisted pursuit of financial gain, she set fire to her home, killing her husband and 2 young children as they slept. The crime took place in Boise, Idaho on February 10, 1992. Rowe, who had a long history of insurance fraud, deliberately set fire to her family's duplex while she was conveniently staying elsewhere. The fire consumed the home in minutes, leaving her husband, Randy Rowe, 34, and their 2 children, Joshua, 10, and Tabitha, 8, dead. Investigators quickly noticed something disturbing. The home's smoke alarms had been intentionally disconnected. Firefighters found the bodies of Randy and the children huddled together, burned beyond recognition. The medical examiner determined they had died from smoke inhalation before they could escape. Suspicion immediately fell on Robin when authorities discovered she had recently taken out multiple life insurance policies on her husband and children, totaling over $250,000. Adding to the horror, police found out she had previously lost a son in a house fire back in 1980 and had collected insurance money from that tragedy too. Robin was arrested 6 months later, in August 1992. Her calm demeanor and lack of remorse only solidified her guilt. In 1993, she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Robin has spent over 30 years behind bars, and with no scheduled execution date, she may never face lethal injection. However, given Idaho's recent push to resume executions, her time may finally be running out. Kimberly Diane Cargill. Kimberly Diane Cargill was a manipulative mother who killed to stop her babysitter from testifying against her in a custody battle. She strangled her, set her on fire, and dumped her body like garbage. The crime took place in White House, Texas, on June 18, 2010. Cargill, 43 years old at the time, was already in legal trouble. Her babysitter, Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old woman with intellectual disabilities, was set to testify against her in a child abuse case. But before that could happen, Cargill decided to eliminate the problem permanently. On the night of the murder, Cargill lured Walker into her car under the pretense of taking her out to eat. Instead, she forced a rag over Walker's mouth, suffocating her. As Walker gasped for air, Cargill held her down until she stopped moving. She then doused Walker's body in lighter fluid, set her on fire, and dumped her in a rural ditch, hoping to destroy any evidence. When authorities found her, she was burned beyond recognition. Cargill tried to cover her tracks, lying to investigators and claiming she had nothing to do with Walker's disappearance. But phone records and witness testimony placed her with Walker that night. In 2012, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. As of now, Kimberly Diane Cargill remains on Texas death row. She has spent over 13 years behind bars, filing multiple appeals, all of which have failed. Carrie Lynn Dalton. In a drug-fueled frenzy, Carrie Lynn Dalton orchestrated a night of pure horror. She and her accomplices stabbed, burned, and bludgeoned a woman to death. The crime took place in Lakeside, California in June 1988. Dalton, a meth addict, became convinced that her friend Irene May had stolen her drugs. Seeking revenge, she lured May to a mobile home where she and her friends turned a brutal beating into a sadistic game. May was stabbed repeatedly with a screwdriver, beaten with a frying pan, and injected with battery acid while her attackers laughed and watched her suffer. As she screamed for mercy, Dalton reportedly cranked up the music to drown out her cries, but May refused to die fast enough. Dalton then smashed her skull with a hammer before wrapping her in plastic and discarding her body. No remains have ever been found. Despite the lack of a body, Dalton was caught when multiple witnesses came forward, horrified by what they had seen and heard. Several testified that Dalton casually bragged about the murder, even reenacting parts of it for entertainment. In 1995, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Carrie Lynn Dalton has been on California's death row for over 30 years. With no remains, no forensic evidence, and California's halt on executions, she may never face lethal injection. But with multiple eyewitnesses sealing her fate, there's no doubt she's guilty. Brittany Marlowe Holberg. Brittany Marlowe Holberg turned her victim's home into a slaughterhouse, where she stabbed and tortured an 80-year-old man, leaving behind a crime scene straight out of a horror movie. The crime took place in Amarillo, Texas, on November 13, 1996. Holberg, 23 years old at the time, was a drug-addicted sex worker who had been desperate for money. That night, she targeted A.B. Towery Sr., an elderly man believing he would be an easy victim. Once inside his apartment, Holberg launched a brutal attack. She stabbed him over 60 times with household objects, including a paring knife, a fork, and a butcher knife. As Towery tried to fight back, she smashed his skull with a hammer and bludgeoned him with a lamp. But the most gruesome part, she shoved a lamppost down his throat, ensuring his death was as slow and agonizing as possible. By the time she was done, his body was unrecognizable. Holberg fled the scene, but was caught 5 days later at a motel in Tennessee. Police tracked her down after witnesses placed her at Towery's apartment around the time of the murder. When arrested, she showed no remorse, even bragging about her drug-fueled rampage. In 1998, Holberg was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The jury took just 90 minutes to decide her fate. Brittany Holberg has spent over 26 years behind bars, filing multiple appeals, all of which have failed. Texas is known for its swift executions, meaning her time could soon be up. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman. Alongside her sadistic partner, Cynthia Lynn Kaufman was a predator who hunted women down, abducted them, and strangled them with her bare hands, leaving their lifeless bodies to rot. The killing spree began in October 1986, spanning multiple states, but most of the murders took place in California. Kaufman and her boyfriend, James Marlowe, would pose as friendly strangers, gain their victims' trust, and then strike. Their victims included 20-year-old Karina Novoa, who was tortured and strangled with a piece of wire, her body discarded like trash in Redlands, California. Another victim, 19-year-old Linnell Murray, was abducted from her job at a dry cleaner, raped, and strangled before being left to decompose. The couple even stole her credit cards and used them at local stores. Kaufman and Marlowe were caught after police linked them to multiple crime scenes using fingerprints, witness testimonies, and stolen credit card transactions. After their arrest, Kaufman tried to shift blame, claiming she was brainwashed and beaten into submission by Marlowe. But her own disturbing confession proved otherwise. In 1990, she was convicted of multiple counts of murder and became the first woman in California sentenced to death since 1977. As of now, Cynthia Lynn Kaufman remains on California's death row. She has spent over 3 decades behind bars, filing appeals. But with California's execution moratorium, she may never pay for her crimes. Meanwhile, her victims never got a second chance. Socorro Susan Caro. In an act of ultimate betrayal, Socorro Susan Caro lined up her young sons in their beds and shot them one by one, leaving behind a crime scene that shocked even the most hardened detectives. The crime took place in Thousand Oaks, California, on November 22, 1999. Caro, a 42-year-old mother of 4, was married to Dr. Xavier Caro, a well-respected physician. But their marriage was falling apart, filled with bitter arguments and accusations of infidelity. Instead of divorce, Susan chose revenge. That night, after putting her children to bed, she retrieved a .38 caliber revolver and walked into each of their rooms. One by one, she pressed the barrel against their heads and pulled the trigger. Joey, 11, Michael, 8, and Christopher, 5, never stood a chance. The youngest, 18-month-old Gabriel, miraculously survived, though he was also shot in the head. After carrying out the massacre, Susan shot herself in the head in a staged suicide attempt, but she survived. When police arrived, they found her bleeding next to the bodies of her sons. The crime scene was pure horror. Tiny beds soaked in blood, lifeless bodies frozen in their final moments. In 2002, Carol was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The jury rejected her defense that she had amnesia from the suicide attempt, and the judge called her actions calculated and ruthless. Socorro Susan Caro remains on California's death row. With the state's moratorium on executions, she may never be executed, but she will spend the rest of her days alone in a prison cell, haunted by the lives she destroyed. Veronica Utilia Gonzalez. Veronica Utilia Gonzalez subjected her 4-year-old niece to months of torture before ending the little girl's life in the most brutal way imaginable. The crime took place in San Diego, California, on November 6, 1995. Gonzalez, then 33 years old, had taken custody of her niece, Genevieve Jenny Rojas, after Jenny's mother was sent to rehab and her father was arrested. But instead of providing a safe home, Gonzalez and her husband, Ivan, turned the little girl into their personal punching bag. Jenny suffered relentless abuse. She was beaten with belts, burned with a hairdryer, and hung by her wrists from a closet hook for hours at a time. She was forced to eat her own vomit and locked in a tiny box as punishment. The torture lasted for months, until one day, Gonzalez finally went too far. Jenny died from severe blunt force trauma, her tiny body covered in bruises, cuts, and burns. Instead of calling for help, Gonzalez stuffed Jenny's body into a plastic container and kept it in her home for days, letting it rot before finally disposing of it. Police uncovered the crime after relatives became suspicious and called authorities. When officers searched the home, they found bloodstains, restraints, and disturbing evidence of long-term abuse. In 1998, Gonzalez was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture and sentenced to death. As of now, Veronica Utilia Gonzalez remains on California's death row. Despite filing appeals, her fate is sealed. With California's execution freeze, she may never face lethal injection, but she will never taste freedom again. Tina LaSonia Brown. Tina LaSonia Brown was responsible for one of the most brutal murders Florida has ever seen. She and her accomplices beat, electrocuted, and then set fire to a young woman, leaving her to die in agony. On March 24, 2010, in Pensacola, Florida, Brown, along with her 16-year-old daughter Brittany Miller and their friend Heather Lee, lured 19-year-old Adriana Zimmerman into their car, claiming they wanted to talk. But Zimmerman had no idea she was about to be tortured. The group drove Zimmerman to a secluded wooded area. There, they brutally beat her with a crowbar, knocking her to the ground. As she begged for her life, they shocked her with a stun gun repeatedly, laughing as she convulsed, but they weren't done. Brown then poured gasoline all over her body and set her on fire, leaving her to burn alive. Zimmerman miraculously survived the flames long enough to crawl for help, suffering horrific burns across her body. She clung to life for 2 weeks before succumbing to her injuries. Authorities quickly arrested Brown and her accomplices after Zimmerman identified them before dying. Brown was convicted in 2012 of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, while Miller received a life sentence, and Lee was sentenced to 25 years after testifying against Brown. Tina LaSonia Brown has spent over a decade on Florida's death row, with no execution date scheduled. However, with Florida actively carrying out executions, it's only a matter of time. Kathy Lynn Serinana. Kathy Lynn Serinana was a monster in disguise. Instead of offering love and protection, she turned her own home into a torture chamber, subjecting her 2 young nephews to unimaginable abuse before brutally ending their lives. During the Christmas season of 2005 in Corona, California, Kathy, alongside her husband, Raul Sarinana, was entrusted with the care of 11-year-old Conrad Morales and 13-year-old Ricky Morales. But instead of giving them a safe home, they tortured the boys for weeks until their small bodies could no longer endure the suffering. The abuse was relentless. Conrad and Ricky were beaten, burned, starved, and forced to endure sickening punishments. The torture escalated until, on Christmas Day, Ricky was found dead, his small frame battered and bruised, hidden inside a closet. His brother, Conrad, had already been murdered months earlier, his decomposing body left in a storage container in the garage. Police uncovered the horror after a 911 call led them to the gruesome crime scene. Kathy initially played the role of a grieving guardian, but her lies quickly unraveled. Investigators discovered that both she and her husband were responsible for months of physical and emotional torment leading up to the murders. In 2009, she was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. Her husband, Raul, received the same fate. Kathy Lynn Sarinana remains on California's death row, but with the state's moratorium on executions, she may never face lethal injection, but rather spend the rest of her life behind bars. Brooke Marie Rodiers. Brooke Marie Rodiers was a manipulative predator who used her looks and charm to lure men to their deaths. She and her accomplices set up a deadly trap promising a night of pleasure, only to rob, suffocate, and murder their unsuspecting victims. The crime took place in Riverside County, California in 2006. Rodiers, 24 years old at the time, along with her partners in crime, Franchon Epps and Omar Hutchinson, devised a plan to lure wealthy men to a motel under the promise of sex, then kill them for their money. Their victims, Milton Chavez and Marvin Gabriel, were targeted and invited to a motel room, believing they were about to have a night of fun. Instead, once inside, they were beaten, robbed, and suffocated. In a disturbing twist, Rodiers used her own undergarments to strangle them, even stuffing panties down one of the victims' throats to ensure he never took another breath. After the killings, Rodiers and her crew rummaged through their victims' belongings, stealing everything they could before fleeing the scene. But their plan quickly fell apart. Police tracked them down through credit card transactions and witness statements. Once caught, Rodiers showed no remorse, laughing and boasting about how easy it had been. In 2010, she was convicted of double homicide and sentenced to death. As of now, Brooke Marie Rodiers remains on California's death row. With the state's moratorium on executions, she may never be executed, but her crimes will forever mark her as one of California's most cold-blooded killers. Susan Diane Eubanks crimes. Similar to Socorro Susan Caro, Susan Diane Eubanks lined up her 4 sons and shot each of them execution style. The murders took place in San Marcos, California, on October 26, 1997. Eubanks, 33 years old at the time, was in a bitter dispute with her ex-boyfriend. Fueled by alcohol, prescription drugs, and pure rage, she decided that if she couldn't be happy, no one else would be either. That evening, Eubanks took her 4 young sons, Brandon, 14, Austin, 7, Brigham, 6, and Matthew, 4, into separate rooms and shot them in the head one by one with a .38 caliber handgun. As her boys pleaded for their lives, she showed no mercy. When the killing was over, she turned the gun on herself, shooting herself in the stomach in a failed suicide attempt. Police arrived after a family friend, worried about the children, called 911. Inside the home, officers found a scene of pure horror. 4 lifeless bodies, blood-soaked blankets, and a mother barely clinging to life. Eubanks survived and was later convicted in 1999 of 4 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death, with the judge calling her crime one of the most heartless killings imaginable. Despite filing appeals, Susan Diane Eubanks has spent over 27 years in prison, but with California's execution moratorium, she may never face lethal injection. Her children never got a second chance, and neither should she. Patricia Blackman. Patricia Blackman didn't just kill her 2-year-old adopted daughter, she beat her tiny body until there was nothing left. The crime took place in Dothan, Alabama, on May 20th, 1999. Blackman, 29 years old at the time, was supposed to be caring for Dominiqua Bryant, a defenseless toddler she had adopted, but instead, she turned into a monster. That night, Blackman punched, kicked, and bludgeoned the child repeatedly in a fit of rage. She then picked up a steel-shanked shoe and struck Dominiqua with full force, leaving deep bruises and skull fractures. When the child stopped moving, Blackman panicked and called 911, claiming that the toddler had fallen off a bed. Paramedics arrived to find Dominiqua's tiny body battered beyond recognition. She had a fractured skull, broken arms and legs, and internal bleeding. There were bruises in the shape of a shoe print, proving she had been stomped on. It was clear this wasn't an accident, it was murder. Blackman was arrested after doctors immediately ruled out a fall as the cause of death. In 2002, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. As of now, Patricia Blackman remains on Alabama's death row. She has filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. With Alabama actively carrying out executions, her time may be running out. Tierra Capri Gobble. In a brutal case of infanticide, Tierra Capri Gobble repeatedly struck and abused her 4-month-old son, leaving him with a crushed skull, broken bones, and internal bleeding. The crime took place in Albertville, Alabama, on July 11, 2004. Gobble, 21 years old at the time, was supposed to be caring for her infant son, Phoenix Cody Parrish. But instead of love, she subjected him to weeks of abuse, delivering blow after blow to the helpless baby's tiny body. On the night of his murder, Phoenix cried uncontrollably. In a fit of rage, Gobble slammed him against a hard surface, fracturing his skull. She then repeatedly hit him, leaving bruises, internal bleeding, and multiple broken bones. When she realized he had stopped breathing, she rushed him to the hospital, pretending he had suffered an accidental fall. Doctors immediately saw through her lies. Phoenix's injuries were far too severe to be anything but abuse. An autopsy confirmed the baby had suffered weeks of beatings before his final, fatal assault. Investigators uncovered a history of neglect and prior injuries, proving this wasn't a one-time incident. It was long-term torture. Gobble was arrested the same day, showing no remorse as officers took her away. In 2005, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The jury rejected her defense that she had been overwhelmed as a young mother. As of now, Tierra Capri Gobble remains on Alabama's death row. With the state's aggressive execution schedule, it's only a matter of time. Her son, who never had a chance to fight back, will never see justice beyond her execution. Margaret Ann Allen. Margaret Ann Allen was filled with pure rage when she tortured and killed her own housekeeper over a missing $2,000. In a shocking act of cruelty, she forced bleach down the woman's throat and strangled her to death. The crime took place in Titusville, Florida, on February 8, 2005. Allen, a mother of 4, had a violent temper and a history of paranoia. When she suspected her longtime housekeeper, Wenda Wright, of stealing from her, she snapped. Allen and 2 accomplices ambushed Wright, tying her up and beating her mercilessly. Wright was forced to drink a lethal mix of bleach and chemicals as she gasped and choked for air. But that wasn't enough. Allen then wrapped duct tape around her mouth, smothering her to death with a belt. Once Wright was dead, Allen dumped her body in a shallow grave and went on with her life as if nothing happened. Her brutal crime was exposed when one of her accomplices cracked and led police straight to Wright's decomposed body. Allen denied everything, but witnesses revealed she had bragged about the murder and even mocked her victim's final screams. In 2011, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The judge called her actions sadistic and inhumane. Margaret Ann Allen has spent over 13 years on Florida's death row and continues to file appeals. But with Florida's aggressive execution policy, she may not have much time left.